A lot of Etsy sellers make changes because it feels like the responsible thing to do. You see a dip in views, maybe favorites slow down, and the instinct is to step in and fix something. A word in the title, a tag, an image, a sentence in the description. None of it feels reckless. It feels careful. It feels involved. And most of the time, it feels like you're helping the listing along rather than hurting it. And if you're being honest, doing something feels better than waiting. Waiting feels like neglect, even when it isn't. What's uncomfortable is that listings don't respond to constant attention the way we expect. The platform doesn't interpret activity the same way a human does. What feels like maintenance to you can look like instability to the system. And over time, that gap between intention and interpretation starts to matter more than any single edit you make. Because the system is trying to understand what your listing is, who it's for, and whether it behaves consistently. If you keep shifting the signals, you're basically asking it to keep redeciding that. Most listing decay doesn't start with one big mistake. It starts with lots of small ones that don't look like mistakes at all. You adjust things one by one, spaced out over days or weeks. Each change feels isolated, but from the outside, what's being seen is a pattern of movement. And movement without recovery time changes how a listing is understood. It's like you're constantly nudging the steering wheel. You're not crashing, but you're never driving straight long enough to see what the road is actually doing. A listing isn't evaluated instantly and then locked in. It's observed over time. How it performs, how buyers interact with it, how consistent its signals are. When you change things too often, the listing never fully settles into a stable state. It's always mid-adjustment, which makes it harder for the system to trust what it's seeing. And this is the part people miss. You're not just updating text. You're changing the conditions while you're trying to measure results. So the results feel confusing because the environment keeps changing. Each meaningful edit doesn't just update text. It changes how the listing is interpreted going forward. Titles, tags, and descriptions are signals. When they shift repeatedly, the system has to reinterpret who the listing is for and how it should behave. Frequent edits interrupt that learning process before it finishes. And this is why sellers sometimes say, "It was doing fine, then I improved it, and it got worse." It's not that improvement is punished. It's that constant redefinition creates uncertainty. The listing becomes harder to place because it keeps becoming a slightly different version of itself. When a listing is stable, performance trends make sense. When it's constantly edited, the data gets noisy. Views fluctuate without clear reasons. Favorites don't line up with changes. Sales don't correlate with effort. From the seller's side, it looks like randomness. From the system side, it looks like inconsistency. And noisy performance is what triggers even more editing. You'll see one day spike, the next day drop, and your brain goes looking for a cause. But the truth is, you may have created a situation where the listing can't generate clean feedback because the signals aren't staying still long enough to show you anything reliable. The tricky part is what happens next. When numbers feel unpredictable, sellers react faster. They check stats more often. They tweak sooner. They try to regain control. But reacting to noisy data usually increases the noise. The listing ends up in a loop where instability creates more instability. And it's easy to justify because every tweak has a reason. This tag is too broad. This keyword is better. The first photo could be cleaner. All reasonable. But if you're making those changes every couple of days, you're not letting the listing complete a full test cycle. You're interrupting it mid-sentence. Because you're doing something, it feels like progress. Effort gives emotional relief, but effort doesn't always equal improvement. In this case, effort can mask the real cause of decline, which isn't a missing keyword or weak image, but the lack of uninterrupted time for the listing to prove itself. A stable listing gives you real information. An unstable listing gives you emotional feedback. It makes you feel busy, but it doesn't help you see clearly. And once you're in that mode, it's hard to stop, because stopping feels like you're giving up, when actually you're giving the listing space to function. Platforms are built to detect patterns, not intentions. They respond better to consistency than activity. A listing that stays the same long enough to produce clear signals is easier to place, test, and surface than one that's always changing. Stability reduces ambiguity. And this doesn't require you to believe in some mysterious algorithm. It's just basic system behavior. If the inputs keep shifting, the output looks unreliable. If the inputs remain consistent, the output becomes easier to predict. A listing that behaves predictably is easier to match to the right buyer behavior, because the system can actually learn what normal looks like for that listing. When you change a listing, you interrupt whatever learning process was underway. That doesn't mean edits are bad. It means they have a cost. If changes happen faster than learning can complete, the system never reaches confidence about the listing's role or audience. So even if your edits are better, you might still see turbulence, and sellers often interpret turbulence as failure. It isn't always failure. Sometimes it's just the system adjusting to a moving target. The calmer move is to treat edits like a deliberate event. Change something, then leave it alone long enough to see what it really does, instead of stacking more edits on top of uncertainty. Listing decay often feels sudden to sellers, but it usually isn't. It's gradual, a slow erosion of trust and clarity. By the time performance noticeably drops, the pattern has already been established. The decline isn't caused by the last edit, but by the accumulation of many before it. It's like wear and tear. The listing doesn't break on a single day. It slowly loses the stability that made it readable. And if you've ever had a listing that used to get steady views, then slowly became erratic, that's often what you're seeing. It's not that Etsy changed overnight. It's that the listing stopped behaving like a stable object and started behaving like a moving one. When results dip, fixing feels logical. But logic based on human reasoning doesn't always match system behavior. The system doesn't reward responsiveness the way a customer would. It rewards signals that remain consistent long enough to be validated. This is where sellers get trapped in helpful behavior. You're trying to be proactive. You're trying to do the right thing. But systems don't usually want constant help. They want consistent input. It's the same reason a recipe fails when you keep changing ingredients mid-cook. You can't tell what worked because you never ran one clean version. Your listing needs a clean version too. Stable listings don't always spike quickly. They compound quietly. Over time, they benefit from accumulated data, clearer positioning, and predictable behavior. That compounding effect only happens when the listing is allowed to stay still. And this is why some sellers seem to do less, but get more consistent results. They don't touch their listings every time they feel anxious. They let the listing build a track record. They protect what's already working. And the funny thing is, stability often looks boring from the outside. It doesn't feel like progress, but it creates the conditions where progress can actually show up and stay. This doesn't mean never editing. It means editing with intention and restraint, making changes in batches, giving them time to settle, letting performance normalize before intervening again. Editing becomes a decision, not a reflex. So instead of, "I'm going to fix this every time it dips," it becomes, "I'm going to run a clean test." One change, one time window, then observe. And if you do need to change multiple things, do it together, on purpose, not scattered across 10 micro edits. That way, the listing becomes stable again sooner, and you can actually interpret what you did. When edits slow down, signals get clearer. Performance becomes easier to read. Trends start to make sense again. You can tell what's working and what isn't without guessing. Clarity replaces noise. And that clarity is what reduces stress. Because when you can see clean patterns, you stop chasing ghosts. You stop doing emergency updates based on one bad day. You stop turning your shop into a constant repair job. Instead, you get to treat your listings like assets. You maintain them, but you don't keep rebuilding them. And that mindset alone changes how you work, because your actions become calmer and more deliberate. Sellers who scale aren't calmer because things work. Things work because they're calmer. They resist the urge to interfere constantly. They protect stable listings and let time do some of the work instead of fighting it. They also understand that most performance swings aren't instructions. A dip isn't always a message. A spike isn't always proof. It's just movement. And if you respond to every movement, you turn your shop into a constant reaction loop. Calm sellers step back, collect more signal, and make fewer, higher quality decisions. They don't treat their listings like a live science experiment that needs daily adjustments. They treat them like stable pages that need room to breathe. Real control doesn't come from constant action. It comes from knowing when not to act. Restraint gives systems room to function as designed. Over time, that restraint turns into reliability. And reliability is what makes your work feel sustainable. Because if you're always editing, you're always in problem mode. But if you decide your rule is, I only edit on purpose, and I give it time, you get your attention back. You get your evenings back. You stop feeling like Etsy is something you have to manage every day like a fragile machine. You shift from panic maintenance to steady operations. Most listing decay isn't caused by neglect. It's caused by overattention. Stability gives listings a chance to build trust and momentum. If you take one thing from this, let it be simple. Don't keep rewriting the same listing to feel better. Make changes deliberately, then give the listing space to settle and speak clearly again. More explanations like this coming to the channel.